Science is a tool that is used to objectively look at reality. Using it, we can answer questions without a biased filter that most people view the world through. In this video, I will be examining the science of the transgender issue, while simultaneously debunking some of the pseudoscience, openly mocking real science, and the people who are transgender. In this debate that is currently taking place in our society, there seems to be two sides, both of which give genuine science backing their positions. One side says that transgender people result from a neurological disorder that puts the wrong brain in the wrong body, where the other side says that it's a mental illness that can be treated with medication. Both sides cite science to back their claims, so I will be examining all the science, and then present the conclusion that science has currently reached. Now, before I go any further, I would like to define some terms, which I got from the Webster Dictionary. Transgender. Of relating to or being a person who identifies with or expresses a gender identity that differs from the one which corresponds to the person's sex at birth. In other words, they are people who feel that they were born into the wrong body. Transsexual. A person who strongly identifies with the opposite sex and may seek to live as a member of said sex, especially by undergoing surgery and hormone therapy to obtain the necessary physical appearance. Put simply, they are people who are transgender but also have or are in the process of going through a transition from being male to female or vice versa. Gender. A person's sex or the behavioral, cultural, or psychological traits typically associated with one's sex. Basically, gender can be used to describe one's biological sex or the characteristics commonly associated with said sex. Sex. Either of the two major forms of individuals that occur in many species, and that are distinguished respectively as male or female, especially on the basis of their reproductive organs and structures, or the categories of male or female given on the basis of one's reproductive organs. Now, sex and gender are commonly mixed up and it can get quite confusing, so I'll try to make it as simple as possible. Sex is physiological, and gender is psychological. Now that we have all that out of the way, we can get into what the science actually says about people who are transgender. Let's start by examining the science cited by people who say that transgender results from the wrong brain being in the wrong body. The human brain is extremely complex and can be divided into many different parts that carry out different functions. However, the brain can be categorized into two different sections based off of the two different types of tissues that make up the brain, called gray and white matter. And when we look at the brains of the two sexes, we see that the ratios of gray to white matter are different. White matter refers to the light-colored neural networks in the brain that affect how the brain learns, where gray matter is the dark-colored sections that affect cognition and processing information. So when it comes to the differences, men have roughly 6.5 times more gray matter than women, and women have roughly 10 times more white matter than men. I'm sure you're probably wondering, what does this have to do with people who are transgender? Well, as it turns out, someone who is transgender has a gray to white matter ratio that matches the gender that they feel they are, as opposed to the one that they were born with. This was initially discovered through autopsy, and has recently been observed through the use of MRI scans. A study published in the Journal of Psychiatric Research examined the brains of 18 untreated FTM trans people. Untreated meaning they hadn't yet begun the transition. This was to ensure that their brains were not influenced by external hormones. The results were compared to 24 male and 19 female heterosexual controls. The researchers found that the white and gray matter structures in the brain matched the gender that they identified with instead of the sex that they were born with. Similar studies have been conducted only to get similar results. There are also many parts of the brain that are sexually dimorphic and have been examined to show that yes, people who are transgender have the brain of the opposite sex. This is a real medical condition that has been well documented by physicians and scientists alike, called gender dysphoria. The best way to treat this dysphoria is with hormone treatments. This dysphoria, or the feeling of being in the wrong body, occurs when hormones distinct to one sex interact with the brain of the opposite sex. And because people with gender dysphoria have the wrong brain in the wrong body, they have the wrong hormones affecting the wrong brain as well. So by changing these hormones, you can help remove this dysphoria. For some, however, they need more to deal with it, so they may undergo a sex change operation. The other side of this ongoing debate in our society argues that transgenderism is a mental disorder, as opposed to a neurological one. The people taking this position will often cite actual scientists and physicians who also hold this position. For example, Dr. Paul R. McHugh, who has at least 125 peer-reviewed medical papers and has written 6 books, holds this position. In a paper published in the New Atlantis titled Sexuality and Gender, McHugh says that the people who are trans have a mental disorder, and he validates this by pointing to statistics on how trans people are more likely to suffer from depression or anxiety. He also explains that most children who say they have these feelings will lose them after puberty. The problem with this paper is that it wasn't peer-reviewed, which is one of the most important parts of the scientific method. Now, this publication is also questionable because it has a clear bias that they present. One article even tries to show the link between vaccines and autism, which shows the credibility of the new Atlantis. So can we conclude that gender dysphoria has nothing to do with mental illness based off this? No. Why? As it turns out, there are many patients who suffer from mental disorders such as schizophrenia who also feel gender dysphoria, which means that in these cases, the dysphoria can be explained by the mental disorder. So instead of treating it with hormones, it's treated with medication and therapy. Now what's going on here? It seems as though science has contradicted itself, giving two answers for the same problem? That can't be right. Only one side can have the right answer. This issue is black and white, as I'm sure some of you watching this are thinking. But that's what's great about science. It doesn't care about your opinions, ideas, or political positions. Science only cares about the objective truth. And the objective truth is, both sides are correct to an extent. It just depends on the situation. But how can doctors tell the difference between people who think they're trans and people who actually are? Well, that's figured out during the psychotherapy phase of someone's transition, where the person suffering from the dysphoria attends months and sometimes even years of therapy. In this step, the best course of action is determined, whether it be hormone treatment or, in rare cases, medication. So that's the science of this issue. Hopefully you learned something about the actual medical condition known as gender dysphoria. If that's all you wanted, then you can leave now, because we're about to enter a realm that can only be described as insanity. I'm obviously referring to the pseudoscience around gender, sex, and the transgender issue. So I'm giving you the chance to leave and look away from the abyss, because they say if you stare at it for too long, it stares back. Now, pseudoscience is usually created to push an agenda because it sounds sciencey, which makes it sound more credible than it actually is. Pseudoscience is defined as a claim, belief, or practice presented as science, but fails to follow the scientific method. Take, for example, Kent Hovind doing creation science. His agenda is to convert as many people to Christianity as possible and replace Darwinian evolution with the myth of creation. He calls what he does science, but has already failed because he starts with the conclusion that the Earth is 6,000 years old and was created in 6 days, then works backwards to prove that conclusion. The scientific method is the exact opposite of that. It requires you to start with an observation of an unexplained phenomenon, where you then work towards an objective conclusion through experimentation and evidence. Here's the pseudoscience on gender.
Basically, it's not correct that there is such a thing as biological sex. But cisnormativity is basically that everyone assumes that there is male and female, and so very little is actually looked at to understand what's actually the case. And scientists have been doing this for at least over 50 years.
Your view would be it's much more complicated than that.
Right, it's not my view. I just know that for over 50 years, scientists have shown that that's not true.
What is the science saying about gender identity? Gender is something that is taught to us. It's not something that we are born with. Gender is taught to us from the moment we are born. Culture determines gender. Gender is put upon us. And the fluidity of that gender is because we grow and we age and we change. So to imply that sex or gender is fixed and always the same is wrong, because things change and nature is never 100%.
Did you hear that? According to him, science says gender and biological sex are taught to us, and they can change. What's interesting is he never provides any sources to scientific literature to support his claims. All he gives are a couple links to some biased articles that make the same claims and fail to provide any sources. I can do the same thing with Answers in Genesis as a source to prove creationism, but that's not science, and for me to claim it is dishonest and misrepresents the men and women who work hard to draw conclusions based off the evidence. Now, what does science say about gender and biological sex? Gender and sex are binary, meaning there are only two sexes and only two genders. Because humans, like many different species, are sexually dimorphic. Di meaning two, morphic meaning shape. Two shapes. Why is this? Well, it's because of how life evolved on this planet. When life first started out, it was simple single-celled organisms that reproduce asexually. but eventually eukaryotic cells evolved, and some of them eventually gained the ability to share DNA with one another. This ability increased the amount of genetic variation, making it easier for organisms to adapt to changing environments quickly, and it also made it harder for parasites to attack the organism. Now this new form of reproduction required 2 organisms to reproduce. Not 3, not 4, not 56, but 2. When these eukaryotic cells became multicellular, this trend continued, and sexual reproduction still required 2 partners to reproduce. And thanks to the different mechanisms like natural selection and sexual selection that drive evolution, many of these species became sexually dimorphic. Male and female evolved. And to accommodate these different body types, different psychological traits developed too. For example, in many species, males tend to be more aggressive, where females tend to be more passive and nurturing. This is gender, and involved right next to biological sex. Now, I'm well aware that there can be rare cases of people who don't fall perfectly into these 2 categories, but does this mean that there are more than 2 genders or sexes? No. Simply because of how life formed. If the first organisms to reproduce sexually did so with more than just 2, then the world would be a very different place. And organisms would need to seek out 2 other sexes that differ from itself. I'm also happy to admit that cultural aspects of gender, or the views of society on gender, are socially constructed. For example, pink for girls and blue for boys, which used to be the exact opposite. Also things like beauty standards. All these things are just as subjective as the other parts of the various cultures that make up a world, and can be physically harmful, like neck rings. But guess what? This is not gender. This is culture. Gender, if you can recall, is the internal traits of the 2 sexes. To say that these things are made up is to deny Darwinian evolution through the process of natural selection and our known evolutionary history. A little earlier I said pseudoscience is usually created to push an agenda, but what agenda might that be? Well, the pseudoscience is talking about gender and sex, and is stating that they are made up to intentionally make men and women different for some reason. I wonder what kind of ideology does that?
Is there such a thing as a female brain or a male brain?
Well, it's difficult to categorize a brain as either male or female. So let's say you cut a brain open and you look at 2 parts, you wouldn't be able to say if it was male or female or even from a transgender or gender neutral person.
Right.
There's a small difference in one of our areas of the brain, the corpus callosum. It connects your 2 hemispheres, and it's slightly bigger in women, but we can't really infer anything on how your brain functions from that.
So if there's no such thing as a female or a male brain, then what's going on with differences that we see in people's behavior?
So the differences we see in people's behavior are mostly a result of our environment and not our biology.
That was intersectional feminist Lacey Green talking to Vanessa Hill from Braincraft. And did you hear what Vanessa said at the beginning?
So let's say you cut a brain open and you look at 2 parts, you wouldn't be able to say if it was male or female or even from a transgender or gender neutral person.
There is no difference between male and female brains. And you can't tell the difference between a transgender brain, a male brain, or a female brain. If you recall, the only way we know that transgenderism is a real medical condition is because of the differences in the brain between the sexes. She basically just said that people who are transgender don't actually exist. So if these differences don't exist, then I'm sure Vanessa and Lacey would agree with this statement.
Being transgender is without a doubt a mental disorder.
The final frontier for LGBT equality is being spat on by these pseudoscientists, ignoring the facts and the science only to spew nonsensical claims disguised as science to push their agenda. The agenda that I'm obviously referring to is intersectionality, a new breed of feminism that separates people into categories on the basis of how oppressed they are. The reason gender comes into play here is because they start with the assumption that the system is designed to oppress women, and one way the system does this is by showing the differences between the 2 sexes and genders. And because the system is doing this, then that means gender and sex are made up to perpetuate the patriarchy, because it wants control, and if you don't believe in it, then you're part of it, and you're a bigot. You know, that sounds a lot like Kent Holvind saying evolution is false and creationism is true. And the system, the satanic Illuminati, is conspiring to cover the truth because it wants to push people away from God. And if you don't believe him, then you're a part of it, and you're a heathen. And a sinner. Like I said earlier, pseudoscience comes with an agenda, and it follows the same pattern regardless of the goals of that agenda. Now, intersectional feminism is saying that gender and biological sex are made up to perpetuate gender stereotypes. And since these things are made up, you can be whatever gender or sex you want. Gender and biological sex are like outfits you can try on to fight back against this social construct. And because gender and sex are just made up, you can make up whatever gender you want. So what happened when people started buying into this narrative?
I'm a Gemini, and my pronouns are she, her, they, them, and I identify as gray gender.
I identify as gender neutral or non-binary. So I really like labels, like most people on my channel know. My favorite label right now is genderqueer, and I'm also definitely questioning, but other words I'm experimenting with are non-binary, gender expansive, gender fluid, and demi-girl.
And I identify as non-binary.
I'm gender fluent. I am non-binary.
This bad idea spread like a cancer, and there are now 56 different genders, most of which are all the same. These genders are called non-binary genders, and they are completely made up. The people who identify as non-binary have been given the title transgenders because they claim to be transgender, but don't actually feel dysphoria. They just like the title because it gives them more oppression points under the intersectional ideology. This 56 gender nonsense has resulted from the pseudoscience produced by the intersectionalists. But it's not affecting society in any way negatively, right? Well, you would be wrong. Pseudoscience is extremely dangerous if it goes unchecked and unquestioned. If Ken had his way, every school in America would be required to burn the books teaching evolution, only to replace them with Bibles. If the well-known spiritual scientist Jordan Peterson had his way, alternative medicine would replace actual medicine, and your loved ones suffering from horrible diseases would get a crystal to hold on to, instead of a cure that's actually been shown to work. This gender pseudoscience has already snuck its way into our society, and has been slowly changing it to fit that agenda. Facebook now gives you the option to choose one of these 56 genders. Countless universities are indoctrinating students to believe these unscientific and unproven claims. And probably the worst of all, laws have been passed attempting to limit your free speech. Recently, New York has enacted a law that requires people to use someone's preferred pronouns such as Z or Zer. Failure to do so can result in a fine of up to $250,000, or the immediate eviction from one's apartment. This violates the First and Eighth Amendment of the United States Constitution. This law prevents you from saying words that don't threaten or harm anyone, but only offend, and then punishes you with an excessive fine or an eviction from your home. This is an Orwellian nightmare that formed because pseudoscience was allowed to infect our society. You don't have the right to tell me what I can and cannot say on the basis of nothing more than your feelings. You also don't get to silence me with threats of fines or the eviction from my home. I'll call you by whatever pronouns you want, but let me do it out of my own free will. To conclude, gender dysphoria is a real medical condition where the wrong brain develops in the wrong body, but there are some rare cases where gender dysphoria can be brought on by mental illness. Physicians have special procedures in place to get the best treatment for someone who's struggling with their gender identity. If you or someone you know is struggling with this, then I urge you to speak to a medical professional whose number one goal is to help you. And unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation being spread about these issues by people whose self-interests and agendas trump truth and other people's well-being. So they push nonsensical ideas like gender and sex being social constructs that are put upon us by society and have nothing to do with our biology. If you made it this far and you believe that these things are really social constructs, then I would like to show you a recreation of an experiment conducted with monkeys and gender-specific toys.
In the original experiment, the psychologist presented the monkeys with typical boy-type toys, trucks and cars, and girl-type toys, mostly dolls. The psychologist then observed which toys the monkeys preferred to play with, and for what length of time.
Okay. Oh, so we've got a male picking up a truck. That's quite interesting.
That's quite funny.
See, he's gone for the truck. But yeah, we'll see if he comes.
He started moving the wheels a bit, which is kind of surprising.
A few more coming over now.
Yeah. So, who's picking up the car over there?
So that's another male. Yeah, spinning the wheels.
Yeah, spinning the wheel. Any girls in on the action yet?
So yeah, this is a girl there, so Zoe, going for the doll.
Going for the
She's
doll.
Quite interesting, isn't she? And then this is also a female here, just called Blondie. The way they investigate it is they'll kind of hold it up, sniff it, chew on it.
And so far the boys have really only displayed interest in the trucks.
Yeah, they've kind of just picked up the trucks.
He's climbed on the truck.
Yeah, he sat on the truck.
He obviously thinks that's kind of a bit like a car, isn't it? In the original experiment, the male monkeys played with the male-type toys for twice as long as they did with the female-type toys.
So that's a little boy just having a look at that doll there.
Yeah.
He's not sure, is he?
No. Our results were even more clear-cut. The males barely touched the dolls, while the females showed hardly any interest in the trucks. Trucks don't seem to turn these girls on very much.
No, they're not really interested, are they?
Although this experiment was controversial, it has been conducted multiple times across many different primate species, getting the same results. In fact, one of the species it was conducted on was humans.
Trond Diseth avdelingsoverlege og professor ved barneklinikken Rikshospitalet og jobber med barn som født med misdannede kjønnsorganer. Og som et ledd I å kunne fastslå om barnet en gutt eller en jente, bruker Diseth en leketest.
Vi har definert 10 ulike leker. Det 4 feminine leker. Det 4 maskuline definerte leker. Og så det såkalte nøytrale leker. Disse til sammen 10 lekene plasseres I et bestemt mønster, og så sitter vi med videoopptak, og observerer barn I berøring av leken. Og det vi da ser klare forskjeller mellom friske gutter og jenter fra 9 måneders alder og oppover. I forhold til at gutter velger maskuline leker, jenter velger feminine leker.
This method is used to determine intersex children's actual sex, so the deformed genitalia can be fixed. Also, this test was conducted on infants who couldn't have been socialized to favor one toy over the other. In response to the 56 gender pseudoscience, I'll say what I say to all pseudoscientists, and it's the most insulting and painful phrase one could receive when in the realm of science. You're not even wrong. But at the same time, you're not even right. Your claims are unfalsifiable and are useless, meaningless drivel that mocks people who actually suffer from a real medical condition. What you are doing is like if I were to say being a paraplegic is a social construct, then started rolling around in a wheelchair, telling people to check their privilege because they don't have to deal with what I do. These people are taking something simple, like gender and sex, and are making them unnecessarily complex for the sake of earning oppression points. So I will leave you with a quote that is appropriate to this nonsense. Any fool can make something bigger, more complex, and more violent. It takes a touch of genius and a lot of courage to move in the opposite direction. Thank you all for watching. I would like to give a shout out to my good friend Telltale, who did some of the drawing animations for this video. And if you like my channel, then I'm certain you'll like his stuff as well. His channel is linked in the description. Help me to replace ignorance with knowledge, and as always, have a nice day.
Alright, I've had enough of this shit. Listen here, you gender fuck. Being transgender means that while your body is physically born one gender, your brain structure and your brain chemistry are constructed in the way of the opposite gender, thus causing you to believe in your mind that you are supposed to be female even though, say, you were born a male. Has nothing to do with you non-binary fucking half-wits. You aren't transgender because you are not transitioning. You can change the English language as much as you fucking want, but you cannot change Latin roots. Latin roots, trans means transition. Trans means change, means movement. You are not moving toward anything, you fucking gender fuck. And I am getting sick and tired of hearing in my comments section and getting messages and emails about transgender people thanking me for calling you assholes out. Because you are making things very fucking difficult for them. People no longer take them fucking seriously because For all people know, it's not actually a transgender, it's just one of you fucking dickheads. I'm getting off before I say some things that are gonna get me some community strikes.